Sarah Martinez sat in the back corner of the music room at Lincoln High School. She always picked the same seat every day. It was near the window where she could look outside when things got boring. More importantly, it was far away from the other students who had fancy instruments and expensive music bags. The old wooden chair creaked when she moved. Sarah kept her worn backpack on the floor next to her feet. Inside the bag were her school books, a water bottle, and a few pencils that she had found in the hallway. She did not have much, but she never complained about it. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front of the classroom. She was a kind woman with gray hair and glasses that always slipped down her nose. She had been teaching music at Lincoln High for 20 years. Mrs. Henderson loved her job, even though the school did not have much money for new instruments or supplies. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. She pushed her glasses up her nose. "Today I have some exciting news to share with all of you." The other students looked up from their phones and notebooks. Sarah continued to stare out the window at the parking lot. She watched cars drive by on the street beyond the school fence. "Our annual spring talent showcase is coming up in 6 weeks," Mrs. Henderson announced. "This year, we want to make it bigger and better than ever before." Some students started to whisper to each other. Sarah heard them talking about what songs they might perform. She heard names of expensive music teachers and private lesson studios. These were things Sarah knew nothing about. "The showcase will be held in the main auditorium," Mrs. Henderson continued. "We expect many parents, teachers, and community members to attend. This is a wonderful chance for you to share your musical talents with everyone." A girl named Jessica Shun raised her hand. Jessica always sat in the front row. She had long black hair and carried a violin case that cost more than Sarah's family spent on groceries in a month. "Mrs. Henderson, will there be prizes this year?" Jessica asked. "Well, Jessica, the real prize is the experience of performing for others," Mrs. Henderson replied. "But yes, we will have some small awards for different categories." More students began to get excited. They talked about what they would wear and which songs they would choose. Sarah listened to their conversations but did not join in. She had never performed music for anyone except her little brother Miguel. "I want everyone to think about participating," Mrs. Henderson said. "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to love music and want to share that love with others." Sarah looked down at her hands. They were small and thin, but they were strong. These hands had spent countless hours pressing keys on an old keyboard at home. But nobody at school knew about that. The bell rang and students started packing up their things. Sarah put her few items back in her backpack and stood up slowly. She waited for most of the other students to leave before walking toward the door. "Sarah, could you stay for a moment?" Mrs. Henderson called out. Sarah stopped and turned around. Her heart started beating faster. She was not in trouble, was she? "I was wondering if you might be interested in helping me organize some sheet music." "After school," Mrs. Henderson said. "I could use an extra pair of hands, and I noticed you're very careful with the materials in class." Sarah nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson, I can help." "Wonderful. Can you stay today after your last class?" "Yes, ma'am." Sarah left the music room and walked through the crowded hallway to her next class. Students pushed past her without noticing. She was used to being invisible at school. It was easier that way. During lunch, Sarah sat alone at a table near the wall. She ate a peanut butter sandwich that she had made that morning. The bread was a little stale, but it was fine. She watched other students laugh and talk in their groups. She wondered what it would be like to have friends who shared her interests. After her last class, Sarah returned to the music room. Mrs. Henderson was there, surrounded by stacks of sheet music and folders. "Oh, Sarah, perfect timing," Mrs. Henderson said. "I need to sort all of this music by difficulty level. Some of it is for beginners and some is quite advanced. Would you mind helping me organize it?" Sarah set down her backpack and began looking through the papers. She could read music well, even though she had taught herself. Her grandmother had left behind some old music books when she passed away 2 years ago. Sarah had spent many hours studying those books. As Sarah sorted through the sheet music, she hummed quietly to herself. she did not realize she was doing. The melody was complex and beautiful. It was from a piece she had been learning on her own. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her work. "Sarah, what song is that you're humming?" Sarah stopped immediately. Her face turned red. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know I was making noise." "Don't apologize," Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. "It was lovely. What piece was it from?" Sarah hesitated. She was not sure if she should say, "It's from a piano concerto by Rachmaninoff." Mrs. Henderson raised her eyebrows. "Rachmaninoff? That's quite advanced music." "Do you play piano, Sarah?" "A little bit," Sarah said quietly. She looked down at the sheet music in her hands. "Where do you take lessons?" Sarah felt embarrassed. "I don't take lessons. I just practice at home sometimes." Mrs. Henderson studied Sarah's face. There was something special about this quiet girl. She had noticed that Sarah always paid attention in class, even when she pretended not to. And now she was humming complex classical music like it was a simple pop song. "What kind of piano do you have at home?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "It's just an old keyboard," Sarah admitted. "It was my grandmother's. Some of the keys stick and it doesn't have pedals. But it still makes music." Mrs. Henderson felt her heart warm. Here was a student who was learning difficult music on a broken instrument, with no teacher, just because she loved it. This was the kind of passion that could not be bought or taught. "Have you ever thought about performing in the talent showcase?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently. Sarah shook her head quickly. "Oh no, Mrs. Henderson, I'm not good enough for that. The other students have real training and nice instruments. I just play for fun." "Sarah, talent and passion are more important than expensive instruments or fancy lessons," Mrs. Henderson said. "Music comes from the heart, not from how much money someone spends." Sarah continued sorting the sheet music, but she thought about Mrs. Henderson's words. Could she really perform in front of people? The idea was both exciting and terrifying. They worked together for another hour, organizing the music and cleaning up the classroom. As Sarah prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson had an idea. "Sarah, would you be willing to come help me again tomorrow? There's more organizing to do, and I enjoy having the company." "Yes, Mrs. Henderson, I like helping you." As Sarah walked home, she thought about the talent showcase. She imagined what it would be like to sit at a real piano in front of an audience. The thought made her stomach feel nervous, but also gave her a strange feeling of hope. When she got home to the small apartment where she lived with her parents and little brother, Sarah went straight to her grandmother's old keyboard. She sat down and began to play, letting the music carry away all her worries about school and friends and fitting in. Tonight, like every night, the music was her escape. But maybe someday it could be something more. 2 weeks had passed since Mrs. Henderson first announced the talent showcase. The music room buzzed with excitement every day as students practiced their pieces and talked about their performances. Sarah continued to help Mrs. Henderson after school, organizing music and cleaning the classroom. During this time, Sarah learned more about her classmates' musical backgrounds. Jessica Chun practiced violin 4 hours every day with a private teacher who charged $50 per lesson. Marcus Williams had been taking guitar lessons since he was 7 years old. Emma Rodriguez sang in a professional children's choir that traveled to competitions across the state. Sarah listened to these stories while she worked quietly in the corner. She never shared her own musical experiences. How could she explain that she had been teaching herself piano on a broken keyboard in her bedroom? How could she tell them that her music education came from YouTube videos and library books? On a Tuesday afternoon, Sarah was helping Mrs. Henderson organize the sheet music cabinet when something terrible happened. Mrs. Henderson's phone rang during their work session. "Hello, this is Mrs. Henderson," she answered. Her face quickly changed, from happy to worried. "Oh no, Jessica. How are you feeling?" Sarah pretended not to listen, but she could hear the conversation. Jessica Shun was on the other end of the phone and she sounded sick. "Yes, I understand. You need to rest and get better. Don't worry about the showcase right now," Mrs. Henderson sighed. After a few more minutes, she hung up the phone and sat down heavily in her chair. Is everything okay, Mrs. Henderson? Sarah asked. Mrs. Henderson sighed. Jessica has mononucleosis. It's an illness that makes people very tired and weak. She won't be able to perform in the showcase. Sarah nodded, but she did not understand why Mrs. Henderson looked so upset. There were many other students who could perform. The problem is, Mrs. Henderson continued, Jessica was supposed to perform a 15-minute classical music segment. She was going to play 3 different violin pieces. Now I have a big empty space in the program, and the showcase is only 2 weeks away. Mrs. Henderson put her head in her hands. She had been planning this showcase for months. The program was carefully organized with different types of music to keep the audience interested. Without Jessica's classical segment, the whole flow of the evening would be wrong. Can another student play classical music? Sarah asked. Most of our students play popular music or simple songs, Mrs. Henderson explained. Jessica was the only one with advanced classical training. I need someone who can fill 15 minutes with serious classical music, and I need them to be ready in 2 weeks. Sarah continued organizing the sheet music, but her mind was thinking about the problem. She knew many classical pieces. She had been learning them on her own for years. But she had never played for anyone except Miguel, her little brother. The next day during lunch, Sarah sat at her usual table near the wall. She was eating her sandwich and thinking about Mrs. Henderson's problem when she heard her name. Sarah Martinez, could you come here for a moment? Sarah looked up and saw Mrs. Henderson standing near the lunch line. She quickly finished her bite of sandwich and walked over. I wanted to ask you something, Mrs. Henderson said quietly. Yesterday you were humming again while we worked. It was a beautiful melody, very complex. Sarah felt her face get warm. I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was doing it. Please don't apologize. You have a wonderful musical ear. What was the piece this time? Sarah hesitated. It was from Chopin. A nocturne. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. You know Chopin nocturnes? Just a few. I've been practicing them at home. Mrs. Henderson looked around the cafeteria to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned closer to Sarah. Sarah, I have something to ask you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Would you be willing to audition for the classical segment of the showcase? I know you said you're not ready, but I'm running out of options. Sarah's heart started beating very fast. Mrs. Henderson, I don't think I can do that. I've never performed for people before, and I only have an old keyboard at home. I don't even know how to use a real piano with pedals. I understand your concerns, Mrs. Henderson said gently, but you clearly know classical music. Your humming tells me that you understand these pieces deeply, not just the notes but the feeling behind them. Sarah looked down at her hands. These hands had played hundreds of hours of music in her bedroom. They knew every key on her grandmother's old keyboard, even the ones that stuck. But playing for an audience was completely different. What would I have to play? Sarah asked quietly. Something simple and beautiful. Maybe Für Elise by Beethoven, or the first movement of Moonlight Sonata, nothing too complicated. Just enough to fill the time with lovely classical music. Sarah knew both of those pieces well. She had learned them months ago. They were much easier than the Rachmaninoff and Chopin pieces she had been practicing lately. Could I think about it? Sarah asked. Of course, take your time. But I do need to know by Friday so I can finalize the program. That afternoon, Sarah went home and sat at her grandmother's keyboard. She played Für Elise and Moonlight Sonata from memory. Her fingers moved easily across the familiar keys. These pieces felt simple now compared to the difficult music she had been learning, but playing alone in her bedroom was one thing. Playing in front of hundreds of people was something else entirely. Sarah's little brother Miguel came into her room while she was practicing. Miguel was 8 years old and loved to listen to Sarah play. He was the only person who had ever heard her music. That sounds really pretty, Sarah, Miguel said. He sat on her bed and listened. Miguel, do you think I'm good at piano? Sarah asked. You're the best piano player in the whole world, Miguel said with a big smile. Sarah laughed. You haven't heard very many piano players. I've heard some on TV and on the radio. You sound better than them. Sarah smiled at her little brother. Miguel always made her feel better about everything. What if I had to play piano in front of lots of people? Do you think I could do it? Miguel nodded seriously. Yes, but why would you want to? Don't you like playing just for me? I do like playing for you. But maybe other people would like the music too. That evening, Sarah's parents came home from work. Her mother, Maria, worked at a restaurant washing dishes. Her father, Carlos, worked at a factory that made car parts. They were both very tired when they got home. Sarah wanted to tell them about Mrs. Henderson's request, but her parents had so many other things to worry about. Money was always tight. They worked hard to pay for rent and food and Miguel's school supplies. Sarah decided to wait. She would think about the audition for a few more days. Over the next 3 days, Sarah found herself humming classical melodies more often. In English class, she hummed Brahms. In math class, she hummed Bach. In the hallway between classes, she hummed Debussy. She did not realize how much she was humming until Mrs. Henderson mentioned it again. Sarah, you've been like a walking classical radio station this week, Mrs. Henderson said with a smile as they organized music after school. Your musical knowledge is really quite impressive. I just like the melodies, Sarah said. Have you thought more about the audition? Sarah nodded. Yes, I'm still scared, but I think I want to try. Mrs. Henderson's face lit up. Really? That's wonderful news, but I need to practice on a real piano first. I've never used pedals before, and I don't know if my playing will sound the same. Of course. You can use the piano here in the music room. We can set up some practice sessions after school. Sarah felt excited and terrified at the same time. She was going to audition for the talent showcase. She was going to play classical music for Mrs. Henderson on a real piano. When should I audition? Sarah asked. How about Friday afternoon? That will give you a few days to practice here, Sarah agreed. She had 3 days to prepare for the most important musical performance of her life. 3 days to prove that a girl with no formal training and a broken keyboard could play classical music well enough for a real audience. As she walked home that day, Sarah felt like her whole world was changing. For the first time in her life, someone believed in her musical abilities. Someone wanted to hear her play. The question was, would she be brave enough to let them listen? Sarah had been keeping a secret for 3 years. Every day after school, while her parents worked their second jobs and Miguel played with toys in the living room, Sarah disappeared into her small bedroom. There, in the corner next to her bed, sat her grandmother's old keyboard. The keyboard was not beautiful. The black plastic case had scratches and dents from years of use. Some of the white keys had turned yellow with age. The power cord was wrapped with electrical tape where it had been repaired. Half of the keys stuck when pressed, and the sound that came out was thin and electronic. Nothing like a real piano, but to Sarah, this broken instrument was magical. 3 years ago, when Sarah was 14, she had been watching a movie with her family. The movie was about a man who fell in love, and during one scene, beautiful piano music played in the background. The melody was sad and hopeful at the same time. It made Sarah feel things she could not put into words. What is that music? Sarah had asked her mother. Her mother did not know. But Miguel, who was only 5 then, said, It sounds like Grandma's keyboard songs. Their grandmother had died when Sarah was 12. Abuela Rosa had been a music teacher in Mexico before she came to America. She had owned a beautiful piano, but when she moved to the United States, she could only bring a small electronic keyboard. After the movie ended, Sarah went to the closet where they had stored Abuela Rosa's belongings. She found the keyboard, still in its case, along with some old music books written in Spanish. Sarah set up the keyboard in her room and turned it on. When she pressed the keys, they made sounds, but many of them were off-key or stuck. That night, Sarah found the movie soundtrack online. The beautiful piano piece was called Piano Concerto No. 2 by a composer named Rachmaninoff. Sarah had never heard of Rachmaninoff, but she knew she had to learn this piece. She started by watching YouTube videos of people playing the concerto. She learned that a concerto was a piece written for one instrument with an orchestra. The piano part was incredibly difficult, with fast runs and complex harmonies. Most pianists studied for years before attempting such advanced music. Sarah did not care that it was difficult. She listened to the piece over and over, memorizing every note. Then she began trying to play it on her grandmother's broken keyboard. The first few months were frustrating. Sarah's fingers were not strong enough to play the fast passages. She did not understand the musical terms in the sheet music she found at the library. Many times she wanted to give up, but every time she felt like quitting, she remembered how the music made her feel when she first heard it. The concerto told a story of struggle and triumph, of sadness turning into joy. It was like reading a book, but with sounds instead of words. Sarah developed her own system for learning music. She would listen to recordings while reading the sheet music, following along with her finger. Then she would practice small sections over and over until her fingers remembered the patterns. When keys stuck on her keyboard, she learned to press them differently or find other ways to make the sounds she needed. She discovered that her local library had music books and CDs. Sarah checked out everything she could find about piano technique and classical composers. She learned about Chopin, who wrote beautiful melodies that sounded like poetry. She discovered Bach, whose music was like mathematical puzzles that always had perfect solutions. She found Debussy, who painted pictures with sound. Each composer became like a friend to Sarah. She spent hours learning their music, understanding their styles, and practicing their pieces on her broken keyboard. She imagined what it would be like to meet them and tell them how their music changed her life. The keyboard's limitations forced Sarah to become creative. When pedals were supposed to sustain notes, she had to use her fingers to hold them longer. When dynamic markings called for loud and soft playing, she had to find ways to create those effects without proper touch sensitivity. These challenges made her more aware of every detail in the music. Sarah's family did not know about her musical studies. Her parents worked long hours and were too tired to notice the soft sounds coming from her room. Miguel sometimes listened at her door, but he was too young to understand what she was doing. Sarah preferred it this way. Her music was private, like a diary written in sounds instead of words. She could express feelings through the piano that she could never say with words. When she was sad about not having nice clothes like her classmates, she played melancholy, Chopin nocturnes. When she felt hopeful about the future, she played bright Bach inventions. The Rachmaninoff concerto became her greatest challenge and her greatest love. The piece was 35 minutes long and required incredible technical skill. Professional pianists spent months preparing to perform it with orchestras. Sarah spent 3 years learning it on a keyboard with sticky keys. She broke the concerto into small sections and worked on each one separately. The opening theme, which started quietly and built to a powerful climax, took her 6 months to master. The fast passages in the middle movement required her to practice scales and exercises that she invented herself. The most difficult part was the cadenza in the first movement. This was a section where the piano played alone, showing off the pianist's skill with rapid scales, dramatic chords, and complex melodies all woven together. Sarah practiced this section every day for a year before she could play it smoothly. As Sarah learned more advanced pieces, she began to understand music theory. She figured out how chords worked and why certain note combinations sounded beautiful or tense. She learned about different musical forms and how composers structured their pieces to tell stories or create emotions. Her small bedroom became like a concert hall in her imagination. She would close her eyes while playing and picture herself on stage with a full orchestra. She imagined the audience listening in amazement as she played the most difficult passages. She dreamed of what it would feel like to take a bow after performing perfectly, but dreams were different from reality. Sarah knew that her keyboard playing was just a hobby. Real musicians had expensive instruments, professional teachers, and years of formal training. They performed in beautiful concert halls wearing elegant clothes. Sarah was just a girl in a small apartment, teaching herself on a broken keyboard. Still, the music gave her something precious. When the world felt too hard or unfair, she could escape into the sounds of Rachmaninoff or Chopin. When she felt lonely at school, she knew that she had friends waiting for her at home in the form of classical melodies. Sarah never told anyone about her musical abilities, not even Miguel. She was afraid that if people knew, they might laugh at her for thinking she could play such difficult music without proper training. She was afraid they might say her keyboard was too cheap and her technique was wrong. So she kept her secret, practicing every day in the privacy of her room. She learned dozens of pieces by heart, from simple batch minuets to complex Liszt etudes. Her fingers grew strong and nimble from years of practice. Her musical understanding deepened with every piece she mastered. What Sarah did not realize was that she was becoming a real musician. She was developing the same skills that conservatory students spent years learning, but she was doing it through pure love and determination. Her lack of formal training was actually an advantage in some ways because she learned to feel the music instead of just playing the notes. Now, as she prepared for her audition with Mrs. Henderson, Sarah wondered if her years of secret practice would be enough. Could she translate her bedroom performances to a real piano in front of a real person? Would Mrs. Henderson be impressed, or would she realize that Sarah was just an amateur with big dreams? Tomorrow she would find out. Tomorrow. For the first time in 3 years, someone else would hear the music that lived in her heart. Friday afternoon arrived faster than Sarah expected. She had spent the week practicing on the school piano after her regular classes ended. The instrument was an old upright piano that had been donated to the school many years ago. It was not in perfect condition, but compared to her grandmother's broken keyboard, it felt like a miracle. The piano had real weight behind the keys. When Sarah pressed them, she could feel the hammers hitting the strings inside. The sound was rich and full, nothing like the thin electronic tones she was used to. Most importantly, it had 3 pedals that actually worked. Mrs. Henderson had shown Sarah how to use the pedals properly. The right pedal sustained the notes, making them ring longer and blend together beautifully. The left pedal made the sound softer and more gentle. The middle pedal was rarely used, but Mrs. Henderson explained what it did anyway. Learning to use the pedals was like learning to drive a car after years of riding a bicycle. Sarah's feet had to develop new coordination, while her hands continued playing. At first, she pressed the pedals at the wrong times or held them too long. But by Thursday, she was starting to get the hang of it. Now it was Friday, and the audition was going to happen in 1 hour. Sarah sat in her last class of the day, staring at the clock on the wall. Math problems filled the blackboard, but she could not concentrate on numbers. Her mind was full of musical notes and rhythms. What if she forgot the pieces? What if her hands shook too much to play properly? What if Mrs. Henderson realized that Sarah was not good enough for the showcase? The bell rang and students began packing up their books. Sarah moved slowly, putting her notebook and pencil into her backpack. Her hands felt cold and shaky. "Good luck with your audition, Sarah," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned around and saw Marcus Williams, one of the guitar players in music class. She was surprised that he knew about her audition. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "Mrs. Henderson told us you might be filling Jessica's spot in the showcase." "That's really cool. I didn't know you played piano." Sarah felt her face get warm. "I'm just trying out. I probably won't be good enough." "I'm sure you'll do great," Marcus said with a smile. "See you later." As Sarah walked through the hallways toward the music room, she realized that other students were starting to know about her audition. The thought made her stomach feel nervous, but it also made her feel important. For the first time in her life, people at school were paying attention to her. Sarah reached the music room and stood outside the door for a moment. She could hear Mrs. Henderson inside, moving chairs and organizing things for the audition. Sarah took a deep breath and knocked on the door. "Come in, Sarah," Mrs. Henderson called out. Sarah opened the door and stepped inside. The music room looked different than usual. Mrs. Henderson had arranged the chairs so that there was a clear view of the piano. She had also placed some sheet music on the piano bench. "How are you feeling?" Mrs. Henderson asked with a kind smile. "Nervous," Sarah admitted. That's completely normal. Even professional musicians get nervous before they perform. The nervousness usually goes away once you start playing. Mrs. Henderson gestured toward the piano. I've put out some sheet music for Fur Elise and Moonlight Sonata, just in case you need to look at the notes. But I have a feeling you know these pieces by heart. Sarah nodded. She had memorized both pieces months ago. Take your time getting comfortable, Mrs. Henderson said. Adjust the bench height, try the pedals, play a few scales if you want. When you're ready, just begin with whichever piece you prefer. Sarah walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. She adjusted it so that her feet could reach the pedals comfortably. Then she placed her hands on the keys and played a simple C major scale just to hear the sound of the instrument. The piano responded beautifully to her touch. Each note was clear and resonant. Sarah played a few chords, experimenting with the sustain pedal. The harmonies blended together in ways that her keyboard had never allowed. This is a lovely instrument, Sarah said. It's been with us for 15 years, Mrs. Henderson replied. It's not a concert grand, but it has a good tone and reliable action. I think you'll find it very responsive. Sarah placed her hands in. Position for Fur Elise. This piece by Beethoven was one of the most famous piano compositions ever written. It started with a simple, memorable melody that everyone recognized, then developed into more complex sections with faster passages. And dramatic moments. Sarah began to play. The opening melody flowed from her fingers naturally, as if she had been playing this piano her whole life. The notes sang out clearly, each one perfectly placed in time. She used the sustain pedal to connect the phrases smoothly, just as she had practiced all week. Mrs. Henderson sat in a chair nearby, listening carefully. Sarah could see her from the corner of her eye, but she tried not to think about being watched. Instead, she focused on the music and let her hands remember what they had learned through hundreds of hours of practice. As Sarah moved into the more challenging middle section of the piece, her confidence grew. Her fingers moved quickly and accurately through the fast passages. She controlled the dynamics carefully, playing some sections softly and others with more power. The pedaling felt natural now, like breathing. When Sarah finished Fur Elise, Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled and said, "That was beautiful, Sarah. Your technique is quite impressive. Where did you say you learned to play?" "I taught myself," Sarah said, feeling proud and embarrassed at the same time. "That's remarkable. You play with real musical understanding, not just technical skill. Would you like to play the Moonlight Sonata as well?" Sarah nodded and positioned her hands for the second piece. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata was completely different from Fur Elise. It was slower and more contemplative, with a haunting melody that seemed to float over gentle arpeggios in the left hand. As Sarah began the famous opening, she felt the music transport her to another world. This piece had always reminded her of sitting by a window on a quiet night, watching the moon shine on empty streets. The melody was simple but deeply emotional, speaking of loneliness and beauty at the same time. Sarah played with careful attention to every detail. She shaped each phrase like a singer would shape a song, breathing life into the notes. The pedaling created a wash of sound that supported the melody like moonlight, reflecting on water. Mrs. Henderson listened with growing amazement. This girl, who had taught herself piano on a broken keyboard, was playing with the sensitivity and musicianship of someone who had studied for years with professional teachers. Every note was purposeful, every phrase had direction and meaning. When Sarah finished the sonata, she kept her hands on the keys for a moment, letting the final notes fade away naturally. Then she turned to look at Mrs. Henderson, waiting for her reaction. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for several seconds. Then she leaned forward in her chair and said, "Sarah, I have to ask you something. Are you sure these are the only pieces you know?" Sarah felt confused. "What do you mean?" "Well, you play with such confidence and musical maturity, and I've heard you humming much more complex music around school. Are there other pieces you've been working on?" Sarah hesitated. She thought about the Rachmaninoff concerto, the Chopin. Nocturnes, the batch inventions, and all the other advanced pieces she had learned in secret. Should she tell Mrs. Henderson about them? I do know some other pieces, Sarah said carefully. Would you be willing to play something else? Something that shows more of your abilities? Sarah's heart started beating faster. This was her chance to share the music that truly lived in her heart, but it was also risky. What if she tried to play something too difficult and made mistakes? What if Mrs. Henderson thought she was showing off? I could play something by Rachmaninoff, Sarah said quietly. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. Rachmaninoff? Which piece? Part of his second piano concerto, the opening theme. Mrs. Henderson stared at Sarah in disbelief. Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto was one of the most difficult and beautiful pieces in the piano repertoire. Professional pianists spent months preparing to perform it with orchestras. How could a high school student who taught herself on a broken keyboard possibly know such advanced music? Sarah, are you certain you want to attempt that? It's extremely challenging music. Sarah looked down at her hands. They were steady now, no longer shaking with nerves. These hands had spent 3 years learning to play this concerto. They knew every note, every rhythm, every expression marking. Yes, Sarah said. May I try? Mrs. Henderson nodded, though she looked skeptical. Of course, please, go ahead. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and heard the opening chords of the concerto in her mind. She had listened to this piece thousands of times, had practiced it, until it became part of her soul. Now, for the first time, she would play it on a real piano for another person. She placed her hands on the keys and began the most important performance of her life. The night of the talent showcase arrived with unusual excitement at Lincoln High School. The main auditorium was buzzing with activity as families filled the seats and students prepared backstage. Sarah stood in the wings, wearing her only good dress, a simple navy blue one that her mother had bought from the thrift store for church occasions. She had spent the last 2 weeks preparing for this moment. After her audition with Mrs. Henderson, everything had changed. Mrs. Henderson had been so impressed with Sarah's performance of the Rachmaninoff that she asked Sarah to play it for the showcase instead of the simple pieces they had originally discussed. Are you sure you want me to play something so difficult? Sarah had asked. Sarah, I have never heard a student play with such passion and understanding, Mrs. Henderson had replied. You have a gift that needs to be shared. The audience deserves to hear real music, not just simple student pieces. Now, as Sarah waited for her turn to perform, she could hear the other acts on stage. Marcus Williams had played 3 popular songs on his guitar, and the audience had clapped enthusiastically. A group of girls had performed a dance routine to a current pop song, and everyone had cheered loudly. Emma Rodriguez was currently on stage, singing a Broadway show tune with her powerful voice. Sarah could hear the audience responding positively to Emma's performance. She was a confident performer who had been singing solos since elementary school. Sarah looked down at her hands. They felt steady, which surprised her. 2 weeks ago, she had been terrified of playing for just Mrs. Henderson. Now she was about to perform for 300 people, and she felt strangely calm. Maybe it was because she had been preparing for this moment for 3 years without knowing it. Every hour she had spent practicing alone in her bedroom had been leading to tonight. Every time she had struggled with a difficult passage or memorized a complex melody, she had been getting ready for this performance. Sarah Martinez, you're next, whispered the student stage manager. Sarah nodded and walked closer to the stage. Entrance. She could see Emma finishing her song and taking her bow. The audience was clapping warmly, and Emma looked happy and confident as she walked off stage. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside Sarah. How are you feeling? Good, Sarah said, and she meant it. I'm ready. Remember, this is your moment. Trust your preparation and let the music speak through you. The audience is going to love what you do. Emma came off stage, smiling and slightly out of breath. Good luck, Sarah, she whispered as she passed. Break a leg out there. The stage manager gave Sarah the signal as she walked out onto the stage. The auditorium looked enormous from where she stood. Hundreds of faces looked back at her from the darkness beyond the stage lights. She could see her parents and Miguel sitting in the fourth row, looking proud and nervous. At the center of the stage sat a beautiful black grand piano. It was much larger and more elegant than the upright piano she had been practicing on at school. This instrument had been rented specially for the showcase, and it gleamed under the stage lights like a jewel. Sarah walked to the piano bench and sat down carefully. She adjusted the height slightly and placed her feet on the pedals. The keys felt smooth and responsive under her fingers as she played a quiet chord to test the sound. The audience was settling into expectant silence. Some people were still whispering to their neighbors, but most were watching Sarah with polite attention. They were expecting another student performance, perhaps a simple classical piece or a popular song arranged for piano. Sarah looked out at the audience one more time. She saw Mrs. Henderson standing in the wings, giving her an encouraging nod. She saw her parents, who still did not fully understand what was about to happen. She saw Miguel, who was bouncing excitedly in his seat. For a moment, Sarah thought about how her life had led to this point. 3 years ago, she had been a lonely girl with no friends and no special talents. She had discovered music by accident and fallen in love with it in private. She had taught herself to play on a broken keyboard because she could not afford lessons or a real piano. Now she was sitting at a concert grand piano in front of hundreds of people, about to perform one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. It seemed impossible, but here she was. Sarah placed her hands in position for the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. She had decided to play the first movement, which would take about 12 minutes. It was ambitious for a student performance, but Mrs. Henderson had encouraged her to be brave. The concerto began with a series of dramatic chords that announced the main theme. Without an orchestra, Sarah would have to create the impression of all the missing instrumental parts through her piano playing alone. She had practiced this many times, imagining the cellos and violins and horns that would normally accompany her. Sarah took a deep breath and began. The opening chords rang out with power and authority. Even from the first notes, something magical happened in the auditorium. The casual chatter stopped immediately. People who had been checking their phones looked up sharply. The quality of attention in the room changed completely. Sarah played the opening theme with the full emotion she had felt when she first heard this music 3 years ago. Every note carried the weight of her years of practice and her deep love for this piece. The piano responded magnificently to her touch, producing rich, singing tones that filled the entire auditorium. As Sarah moved into the more complex sections of the concerto, the audience began to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not a simple student recital piece. This was advanced, professional-level music being performed with remarkable skill and maturity. Sarah's technique was flawless, but more importantly, her musical understanding was profound. She played each phrase with purpose and direction. The fast passages sparkled with clarity and precision. The slow, lyrical sections sang with genuine emotion. She used the piano's full dynamic range, from whisper-soft touches to thunderous fortissimos. Parents who had come expecting to politely applaud their children's efforts found themselves leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed in the music. Students who had been fidgeting and whispering were now sitting in stunned silence. Even the janitors who had been cleaning up in the back of the auditorium stopped their work to listen. Mrs. Henderson stood in the wings with tears in her eyes. In 20 years of teaching, she had never heard a student performance like this. Sarah was not just playing the notes correctly, she was bringing the music to life, making it speak directly to people's hearts. As Sarah approached the cadenza section, the most technically demanding part of the movement, she felt completely connected to the music. Her hands moved across the keys with confidence and grace. The rapid scales and arpeggios that had taken her months to master now flowed effortlessly. The dramatic chords rang out with perfect timing and balance. The audience was now completely silent, hanging on every note. People who knew nothing about classical music could tell they were hearing something special. The music was telling a Story of struggle and triumph, of darkness giving way to light, of dreams becoming reality. Sarah had never felt so alive as she did in this moment. All her years of practicing alone in her small bedroom had prepared her for this. All her dreams of playing for an audience were finally coming true. She was no longer the invisible girl in the back of the music class. She was a musician, sharing her gift with the world. As she played the final, soaring melody of the movement, Sarah felt the music lifting her above all her worries and insecurities. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The broken keyboard, the tiny apartment, the second-hand clothes, none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the music flowing through her fingers and into the hearts of everyone listening. The last notes of the concerto rang out in the hushed auditorium. Sarah held her hands on the keys for a moment, letting the final chord fade naturally. Then she lifted her hands and sat quietly, looking down at the keyboard. For several seconds, the auditorium was completely silent. Then, like a dam bursting, the applause began. What happened next was something Sarah had never experienced in her entire life. The silence that followed her performance lasted only 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. In those 3 seconds, Sarah wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Had she played too loudly? Had she made errors she did not notice? Why was everyone so quiet? Then the applause began, and Sarah realized the silence had not been disapproval. It had been amazement. The clapping started slowly, with a few people in the front rows. But within seconds, it spread through the entire auditorium like wildfire. People were not just clapping politely, they were applauding with genuine enthusiasm and excitement. Sarah could hear individual voices calling out "Bravo!" and "Wonderful!" As the applause continued. People began to stand up. First it was just a few adults in the front rows, then entire sections of the audience rose to their feet. Soon nearly every person in the auditorium was standing and clapping with tremendous energy. Sarah sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had dreamed of playing for an audience, but she had never imagined anything like this. The sound of 300 people clapping seemed to fill every corner of the large auditorium. She could feel the appreciation and excitement in the air around her. Mrs. Henderson appeared on stage beside the piano, clapping enthusiastically and smiling with tears streaming down her face. She gestured for Sarah to stand up and take a proper bow. Sarah rose from the bench. Still feeling slightly dizzy from the performance and the crowd's response, she took a small bow, the way she had seen musicians do in videos online. The applause grew even louder. People were whistling and cheering now, treating her performance like a professional concert rather than a high school talent show. In the fourth row, Sarah's parents were on their feet, clapping harder than anyone. Around them, her mother, Maria, was crying with joy and pride. Her father, Carlos, who rarely showed emotion, had a huge smile on his face and was whistling loudly. Miguel was jumping up and down in his seat, yelling, "That's my sister! That's my sister!" Behind her parents, Sarah could see other families she recognized from the neighborhood. Mrs. Chun, who owned the corner grocery store, was wiping tears from her eyes. Mr. Rodriguez, who worked with Sarah's father at the factory, was shaking his head in amazement and clapping vigorously. Throughout the auditorium, Sarah could see the faces of her classmates. Marcus Williams was standing with his mouth open, clearly shocked by what he had just heard. Emma Rodriguez, who had performed so confidently just minutes before, was applauding with obvious respect and admiration. Even Jessica Shun's parents, who had come to support the school despite their daughter's illness, were on their feet clapping. The applause continued for what felt like several minutes, though it was probably only about 30 seconds. Finally, Mrs. Henderson stepped forward and raised her hand to quiet the audience. The clapping gradually subsided, but people remained standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Henderson said into the microphone, "you have just witnessed something truly extraordinary. Sarah Martinez is a junior here at Lincoln High School, and what you heard tonight was self-taught. She learned to play this incredibly difficult piece on her own, practicing on an old keyboard at home." This announcement caused another wave of amazed murmurs to ripple through the audience. People looked at each other in disbelief. a self-taught high school student, had just performed one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire with the skill of a professional musician. "Sarah," Mrs. Henderson continued, "would you like to say anything to the audience?" Sarah took the microphone with trembling hands. She had never spoken to such a large group before, and her voice felt small and uncertain. "Thank you," she said, quietly. "I just wanted to share some music that I love very much. Thank you for listening." Her simple, humble words somehow made the performance even more powerful. Here was a teenager who had achieved something remarkable, but she remained modest and grateful. The audience responded with another round of warm applause. As Sarah walked off the stage, she felt like she was floating. The experience had been so intense and wonderful that it almost felt like a dream. But the continued sound of clapping behind her proved that it had really happened. Backstage, Sarah was immediately surrounded by other students and their families. Everyone wanted to congratulate her and ask questions about her playing. Where had she learned such advanced music? How long had she been studying piano? Did she plan to pursue music professionally? Sarah answered their questions as best she could, but she still felt overwhelmed by all the attention. For 3 years, her musical life had been completely private. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to know about it. "Sarah, that was incredible," said Emma Rodriguez. "I had no idea you could play like that. You should audition for the county youth orchestra." "I've been playing guitar for 8 years, added Marcus Williams, "and I've never heard anything like what you just did. That was amazing." Even students who had never spoken to Sarah before were coming up to introduce themselves and compliment her performance. For the first time in her high school career, Sarah was the center of positive attention. A man in a dark suit approached Sarah and her parents. He looked professional and important, and Sarah wondered who he was. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Are you Sarah Martinez?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "My name is Dr. Robert Chun, no relation to Jessica Chun in your music class," he said with a smile. "I'm a professor of music at the State University. I came tonight to hear my neighbor's daughter perform, but I have to say, your performance was the highlight of the evening." Sarah's parents looked impressed and slightly confused. They were not sure why a university professor would want to talk to their daughter. "Sarah," Dr. Chun continued, "have you ever considered studying music formally? Your natural ability is quite remarkable, but with proper training, you could develop into a truly exceptional pianist." "I don't think we can afford music lessons," Sarah's mother said quietly in Spanish. Dr. Chun understood some Spanish and responded gently. "Actually, I was thinking about something different. The university has scholarship programs for talented students. Based on what I heard tonight, Sarah might be eligible for significant financial aid to study music." Sarah felt her heart racing. A university scholarship? She had always assumed that college was impossible for her family because of the cost. But a scholarship might change everything. "Would you be interested in visiting our campus?" Dr. Chun asked. "You could meet some of our faculty and see our facilities. There's no obligation, but I think you might find it interesting." Sarah looked at her parents, who nodded encouragingly despite their uncertainty about the situation. "Yes, I would like that very much," Sarah said. Dr. Chun handed her a business card. "Please call my office next week and we'll arrange a visit. And Sarah, congratulations on a truly beautiful performance tonight." As Dr. Chun walked away, Sarah stared at the business card in her hand. Everything was happening so fast. This morning, she had been worried about playing well enough to avoid embarrassment. Now, a university professor was talking about scholarships and campus visits. The rest of the showcase continued with the remaining student performances. But Sarah hardly paid attention. She was still processing what had happened to her. In the span of 12 minutes, her entire life had changed direction. As the evening ended and families began to leave the auditorium, Sarah was approached by dozens of people who wanted to shake her hand or tell her how much they had enjoyed her playing. Local newspaper reporter asked to take her photograph and interview her for the community section. Mrs. Henderson found Sarah as the crowds were thinning out. "Sarah, I want you to know how proud I am of you tonight. You trusted your abilities, and shared your gift with all of us. That takes tremendous courage. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you for believing in me and giving me this chance. This is just the beginning, Sarah. Tonight you discovered that you're not just someone who plays piano as a hobby. You're a real musician with something important to share with the world. As Sarah walked out of the auditorium with her family, she looked back at the stage where the grand piano still sat under the lights. A few hours ago, she had been terrified of that stage. Now, she could not wait to perform again. The quiet girl who used to sit in the back of music class was gone. Forever, in her place was a confident young musician who had found her voice and was ready to share it with the world. The standing ovation that followed Sarah's performance was unlike anything anyone at Lincoln High School had ever experienced. What started as polite applause quickly transformed into something extraordinary, a genuine outpouring of emotion. An appreciation that seemed to surprise even the audience members themselves. The applause was not just loud. It was sustained and enthusiastic. For nearly 5 full minutes, 300 people remained on their feet, clapping with an energy that filled every corner of the auditorium. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were shaking their heads in amazement, as if they could not believe what they had just witnessed. Sarah stood at the piano, taking small bows and trying to process what was happening. She had expected polite clapping, maybe some encouraging smiles from her parents and Mrs. Henderson. She had never imagined that her music could move people to respond with such overwhelming enthusiasm. In the front row, the school principal, Mr. Thompson, was applauding vigorously and nodding his approval. He had attended dozens of student showcases over the years, but he had never seen anything like this. Next to him, the superintendent of schools was making notes on her program. Clearly impressed by what she had heard throughout the auditorium, parents were turning to each other with expressions of amazement. Many of them had come expecting a routine school performance, something to endure politely for the sake of their children. Instead, they had been treated to a concert-quality performance that rivaled anything they might hear at the city's performing arts center. Did you know she could play like that? One mother whispered to another. I had no idea, came the reply. That was absolutely incredible. Similar conversations were happening all over the auditorium. Parents who had never heard of Rachmaninoff were asking their neighbors about the piece Sarah had played. Students who thought classical music was boring were suddenly interested in learning more about it. The local newspaper photographer, who had planned to take a few routine photos for the community page, was snapping pictures rapidly. He had covered hundreds of school events, but he recognized that this performance was newsworthy in a way that most student showcases were not. In the fourth row, Sarah's family was experiencing emotions they had never felt before. Her parents, who worked long hours at demanding jobs, had always known their daughter was special, but they had never seen evidence of a particular talent. Tonight, they were watching their quiet, studious daughter receive the kind of recognition usually reserved for professional performers. Miguel was beside himself with excitement. He had always loved listening to Sarah play at home, but seeing hundreds of people respond to her music with such enthusiasm made him feel incredibly proud. He kept tugging on his mother's sleeve and saying, "That's Sarah, that's my sister." As the applause finally began to die down, people remained standing and continued to show their appreciation through smiles, nods, and occasional bursts of renewed clapping. The energy in the room had completely changed from the beginning of the evening. Mrs. Henderson stepped to the microphone, her own eyes bright with tears of joy and pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice slightly trembling with emotion, "I have been teaching music for 20 years, and I have never had the privilege of presenting a student performance of this caliber." Her words prompted another wave of applause and several shouts of agreement from the audience. "What makes Sarah's achievement even more remarkable," Mrs. Henderson continued, "is that she is entirely self-taught. She learned this incredibly challenging piece by listening to recordings and practicing on an old keyboard at home. She has never had formal piano lessons." This revelation caused audible gasps throughout the auditorium. People looked at each other in disbelief. Professional pianists typically studied for years with expert teachers before attempting pieces like Rachmaninoff's piano concerto. No, too, the idea that a high school student had taught herself to play it was almost beyond comprehension. Furthermore, Mrs. Henderson added, until 2 weeks ago, Sarah had never played on a real piano. Everything you heard tonight was accomplished on an instrument with broken keys and no pedals. The audience erupted in another round of amazed applause. Sarah's achievement was beginning to seem almost superhuman to the people listening. They were witnessing not just talent but determination and dedication of an extraordinary degree. Dr. Chun, the university music professor, was furiously writing notes on his program. He had attended the showcase to support his neighbor's child, but he was now witnessing the kind of raw talent that music schools dream of finding. He made a mental note to contact his colleagues in the piano department immediately. Several other important people in the audience were having similar thoughts. The director of the City Youth Symphony was already planning to approach Sarah about auditioning. A local piano teacher who specialized in advanced students was wondering if she could offer Sarah a scholarship for lessons, behind the scenes. Word of Sarah's performance was already spreading beyond the auditorium. Students and parents were posting videos and photos on social media. Text messages were being sent to friends and family members who had not attended the showcase. Within hours, Sarah's performance would be the talk of the entire community, but in that moment, as the applause continued to wash over her, Sarah was focused on something much simpler and more personal. She was thinking about her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, who had left behind the broken keyboard that started Sarah's musical journey. Sarah remembered the stories her mother had told about Abuela Rosa's life in Mexico, where she had been a respected music teacher. Rosa had owned a beautiful piano and had taught dozens of students over the years. When she moved to America, she had to leave that piano behind, bringing only the small electronic keyboard that eventually found its way to Sarah's bedroom, standing. On the stage, receiving applause from hundreds of people, Sarah felt connected to her grandmother in a way she had never experienced before. It was as if Abuela Rosa's love of music had traveled through the broken keyboard and into Sarah's heart, where it had grown into something powerful enough to move an entire auditorium full of people. The applause was finally beginning to subside. But people were still standing and smiling. Many were wiping tears from their eyes, moved not just by the beauty of the music but by the story behind it, a young woman from a humble background, who had achieved something extraordinary through pure determination and love. Sarah took one final bow and walked toward the wing of the stage where Mrs. Henderson was waiting. As she passed the piano, she touched the edge of the keyboard gently, almost like saying goodbye to a friend who had helped her accomplish something amazing. The audience was still on its feet as Sarah disappeared backstage, but the applause was gradually transforming into excited conversation. People were already talking about how they would remember this performance for years to come. Parents were telling their children that they had just witnessed something truly special. In the months and years that followed, many people in that auditorium would describe Sarah's performance as one of the most moving musical experiences of their lives. They would remember not just the technical brilliance of her playing, but the emotional honesty and pure joy she had brought to the music. But for Sarah, the most important part of the evening was not the applause or the recognition. It was the moment when she realized that music was not just something she did in private for her own enjoyment. It was a gift she could share with others, a way to connect with people and touch their hearts. As she stood in the wings, still trembling slightly from the intensity of the performance and the audience's response, Sarah knew that her life had changed forever. The quiet girl who had hidden her talent for 3 years was gone. In her place was a confident young musician who was ready to share her gift with the world. 1 week after the talent showcase, Sarah's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The performance that was supposed to fill a 15-minute gap in a high school program had become the talk of the entire community and beyond. The local newspaper had run a front-page story about Sarah's performance, complete with a large photograph of her at the piano. The headline read, "Local student's self-taught piano performance amazes audience." The article described her humble background, her years of practice on a broken keyboard, and the standing ovation that followed her performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano concerto, no, two dot, but the newspaper story was just the beginning. Someone had recorded Sarah's performance on their phone and posted it online. Within days, the video had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Comments poured in from musicians, music teachers, and ordinary people who were moved by both Sarah's talent and her story. Professional musicians began reaching out to Sarah's family. A concert pianist who lived 3 hours away offered to drive to Sarah's town to give her free lessons. The principal violinist of the State Symphony Orchestra invited Sarah to attend one of their concerts as a special guest. Music schools from across the region sent information about their programs and scholarship opportunities. Dr. Chun, the university music professor who had introduced himself after the showcase, had followed through on his promise. He arranged for Sarah and her parents to visit the university campus, where they met with the dean of the music school and several piano faculty members. The visit had been overwhelming in the best possible way. The music building was filled with practice rooms where advanced students worked on challenging pieces. Sarah heard beautiful music coming from behind every door they passed. The concert hall was a magnificent space with a Steinway grand piano that gleamed under the stage lights. "Sarah," the dean had said during their meeting, "we would like to offer you a full scholarship to study here. Your performance shows extraordinary natural ability, and we believe you could develop into a truly exceptional artist with proper training." Sarah's parents had sat in stunned silence. A full scholarship meant that Sarah could attend university without any cost to the family. It meant she could study music seriously and perhaps build a career doing what she loved most. But the most meaningful change in Sarah's life was not the attention or the opportunities. It was the way music had transformed from a private refuge into a bridge that connected her to other people. At school, Sarah was no longer the invisible girl in the back of the classroom. Students who had never noticed her before now approached her in the hallways to compliment her performance or ask questions about music. Teachers looked at her with new respect and interest. The principal had announced over the school's public address system that Lincoln High was proud to have such a talented musician among its students. Mrs. Henderson had arranged for Sarah to give a short performance at the next school board meeting, where she played for district administrators and community leaders. The response was equally enthusiastic, and several board members spoke about the importance of supporting arts education in schools. More importantly, Sarah had discovered that sharing her music brought her joy in a way that playing alone never could. The connection she felt with the audience during her performance had been magical, a moment when her private passion became a shared experience that moved and inspired others. The city's community center had asked Sarah to perform at their annual fundraising dinner. A local retirement home invited her to play for their residents. The Children's Hospital wanted her to give a concert for young patients and their families. Sarah found herself saying yes to these opportunities, excited to share her music with different audiences. With each performance, Sarah's confidence grew. She was learning to speak about music in interviews and to feel comfortable on stage. She was discovering that her talent was not just a personal gift, but something that could bring happiness and inspiration to others. Sarah also began working with a piano teacher for the first time in her life. Dr. Chun had recommended a professor emeritus from the university who specialized in advanced students. Mrs. Williams was a patient and encouraging teacher who helped Sarah refine her technique while respecting the musical instincts that had developed during her years of self-teaching. "Your approach to music is very natural and emotional," Mrs. Williams told Sarah during one of their lessons. "Many students who have formal training from the beginning sometimes lose that spontaneous connection to the music. You have something special that should be preserved and enhanced, not changed." The lessons were helping Sarah understand music theory and piano technique in new ways, but they also confirmed what she had always known, that music was most powerful when it came from the heart. Perhaps the most touching change in Sarah's life was what happened with her family. Her parents, who had always worked long hours and worried about money, began to see new possibilities for their daughter's future. They attended every one of Sarah's performances, Beaming with pride as their quiet daughter transformed into a confident young artist, Miguel had become Sarah's biggest fan and unofficial manager. He told everyone at his elementary school about his sister's talent and insisted that they watch the videos of her performance online. He had even started asking Sarah to teach him to play piano on their grandmother's old keyboard. The keyboard itself had been retired to a place of honor in the family's living room. A local piano store, inspired by Sarah's story, had donated a used upright piano to the family so that Sarah could practice on a real instrument at home. The old keyboard remained as a reminder of where Sarah's journey had begun. Sarah often thought about the night of the talent showcase and how one performance had changed everything. She remembered the fear she had felt standing backstage, worried that she was not good enough to play for an audience. She remembered the moment when she placed her hands on the keys and realized that all her years of practice had prepared her for exactly this opportunity. Most importantly, she remembered the feeling of sharing music she loved with people who appreciated it. That connection between performer and audience, the moment when music became a language that everyone could understand regardless of their background or education, was what made all the practice and preparation worthwhile. As Sarah prepared for her graduation from high school and her transition to university, she reflected on the lessons she had learned from her musical journey. Talent alone was not enough. It had to be combined with dedication, practice, and the courage to share one's gifts with others. Financial limitations and lack of formal training did not have to prevent someone from achieving their dreams, if they were willing to work hard and never give up. But perhaps the most important lesson was that music, like all art, was meant to be shared. The years Sarah had spent playing alone in her bedroom had been valuable for developing her skills, but the real purpose of music was to create connections between people, to express emotions and experiences that words could not capture, and to bring beauty and inspiration into the world. Sarah's story became an inspiration to other young people in her community who had talents but felt limited by their circumstances. She began mentoring younger students, teaching them that passion and determination could overcome many obstacles. She showed them that it was possible to pursue their dreams even when the path was not clear or easy. Looking back on her transformation, from a shy, unknown student to a confident young musician with a bright future ahead of her, Sarah realized that the most important moment had not been the standing ovation or the scholarship offers or the newspaper articles. It had been the moment when she decided to trust in her abilities and share her music with others. That decision had changed everything, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who heard her play and was reminded of the power of music to move hearts, inspire dreams, and transform lives. The girl who had been told to play a simple piano tune had indeed ignited the stage with pure brilliance. But more importantly, she had discovered that her greatest strength was not in hiding her talents, but in sharing them boldly with the world.